All right, Sagar, what are we looking at?
Well, at this point, it looks pretty likely that absent a black swan event, Donald J. Trump is going to be the next Republican nominee for president. Whether he wins is another matter entirely, but I subscribe to a lesson all Americans should have learned in 2016. If you're the nominee, you can damn well win the presidency. And as CNN reminded its viewers very recently, there's a very good chance and likelihood that Trump actually does win the election against Joe Biden, who is facing his own host of problems. This raises a really interesting question. What actually happens if Trump is reelected? There's a whole host of monologues I could do about what it would look like from a domestic perspective. But for this purpose, I wanted to zoom in on something that I, of course, care a lot about: our foreign policy and military resources, and specifically redirecting them away from Eurocentrism and direct them towards actual American interests alone. On this front, Trump, Ron DeSantis, and Vivek Ramaswamy are the only ones who even rhetorically take a different pitch than the rest of the Republican field. The rest of the world is certainly taking notice. I was especially caught in some very humorous moments that the Wall Street Journal took a survey of European diplomats who are freaking out at the prospect of another Trump presidency. The journal cites numerous European politicians who are aghast at two prospects. One, that Trump would slap them with tariffs should he become president again, and at the idea they would actually have to pay Ukraine's bills if he won. This quote in particular hit home to me. Quote, French officials have been warning European allies the possibility of a Trump return requires the continent to significantly expand arms production from artillery to missile defense systems so that it can supply Ukraine on its own. Did you hear correctly? The Europeans are worried they may actually have to pay the bills for the war that most affects them. And remember, Germany, the largest power on the continent and literally has a massive land war raging next door, still refuses to even commit itself to the necessary minimum of 2% to maintain NATO alliance membership in good standing. That is what type of freeloaders that these people are. It says more about Biden that he lets them get away with it. It is clear that a Trump victory at this point, maybe even regardless of policy, would dramatically change the way Europe approaches the Ukraine conflict and realign our priorities. But what really has Europe's attention right now, it's not just Ukraine. It's a little noticed policy proposal in our press that has been widening eyes across the world. Trump is increasingly coming around to the idea of a 10%, quote, universal baseline tariff on all imports to the United States. The idea is to create a, quote, ring around the U.S. economy. And behind the tariff, of course, is to try and lower the cost of U.S.-produced goods and give an advantage to U.S.-based businesses selling domestically. This lit a fire across the pond. European countries heavily are dependent on U.S.-based exports are freaking out at the Trump return. Recall, Biden agreed to roll back some of the major Trump tariffs on European-based steel and aluminum, which garnered more complaint from them than any single policy that Trump ever enacted. Europeans since have even been smarting since the Trump imposed those tariffs before COVID and have continued to be upset after Biden imposed modest Made in America provisions into the Inflation Reduction Act for the electric vehicle supply chain. The Trump proposal reveals the limits of so-called Biden's commitment to some America First trade policy. The White House blasted the Trump 10% tariff, saying, quote, combining a sweeping tariff tax on the middle class with more trickle-down welfare for the rich special interests would stifle economic growth and fuel inflation. The irony is that the Biden White House is using the same talking points that would apply to their own tariffs in place right now against China. The whole point is that buying this agenda, the neoliberal agenda around cheap goods, as the end-all be-all is exactly the philosophy that landed us in a place where we can't make a damn thing to save our own lives. The reason that we even have high inflation is because the cost of goods was raised dramatically on us by supply chain disruptions from around the world. We have no choice but to pay for it. If we had it here already, maybe we would have paid a little bit more in the past, but not even close to as much as we did after COVID. Not to mention all of the heartache and the pain and the suffering that losing our industrial middle class did to millions of people around the globe. There is plenty to criticize Trump on, if you ask me. Mostly that if he didn't actually do anything that he said he was going to do. But he was right about America's foolish relationship with Europe, and he was absolutely right to declare a trade war against America's supposed partners, which are taking us to the cleaners. Much of this comes back to a major moment from the GOP debate that I still can't really get out of my head. That was the battle between Mike Pence and Vivek Ramaswamy.
Vivek, if we do the giveaway that you want to give to Putin to give him his land, it's not going to be too long before he rolls across a NATO border. And frankly, our men and women of our armed forces are going to have to go and fight him. I want to let the Ukrainians fight and drive Putin and the Russians back out into Russia.
I want to just briefly address Pence, Vice President Pence. I have a newsflash. The USSR does not exist anymore. It fell back in 1990.
More than anything was the real clash, the new versus the old. Is America a nation in decline that needs to be saved and needs to husband its resources to secure its future? Or are we a country with such abundance and such petty considerations, they don't matter to us? To me, the answer is obvious. It's the former. It's why Trump was right. He declared American carnage in 2016. It's also why the rest of the world hates that vision that he brought so much. Setting up America up for success is directly bad for them because their success has come at our expense. I'm curious what you make of the 10% tariff war. It's kind of interesting.
Hey guys, obviously I had a lot of thoughts on what Saagar had to say there. So if you want to see my thoughts on this monologue and every other Saagar monologue, make sure you subscribe at breakingpoints.com.